Good morning and welcome to a live stream of the ACT Chess Association online events. My name is Sean Press. I organise these events on behalf of the ACT Chess Association. And the event we're looking at today is our August Standard, which is a long time control event, a bit of a rarity for an online tournament, played with a time limit of 45 minutes and 15 seconds a move. It was played last night, 3rd of September, and it was in fact the final round of our August event, and in the end the winner was Sully Avancible with a very impressive 5.5 out of 6. In second place was Matt Radicic, who finished on 4.5, a point behind. And in third place was Vinay Kumar and Tim Pearce, who tied on 4 points. Not only was it the final round, though, of the August Standard, it's also the final round for all our standard events, as a number of ACT chess clubs are now going back, including the Canberra Chess Club, which meets on Thursday nights, which was last night's meeting night. So we've decided not to clash those tournaments. And so from next week, the only event that we'll be running online is our Wednesday Rapid from 7 o'clock on chess.com. So the game I'm looking at tonight is a bit of a surprise. It's a drawn game. I tend not to choose drawn games. I do like one side winning or the other. And I'm featuring Eric McPherson and Lauren Rice. And they're both overseas players as well. So this is interesting. We did open the tournament up for people both who had a connection with the ACT chess scene. And Eric McPherson had been a long-time member, but now lives in Ireland, so he plays early morning his time. And Lauren Rice has less of a connection with the ACT chess scene, but we were happy for overseas players who weren't getting these sort of events in their local jurisdictions from joining in, and so both of them have been regular players in this tournament for quite a while. So off we go. Time limit, as I said, 45 minutes plus. I've said 10 seconds a move. I probably set that should be 15 seconds a move, to be honest, so I think they might have made a slight mistake in their challenge. But e4, c6, d4, d5, so Caro-Kann, e5, bishop f5. g4 came as a bit of a surprise here. There's a number of other choices here. And the bishop's going to go back to g6, but every now and then you flick in bishop e4 to hit the rook in the corner, because the idea is you force white to play f3 here. And as much as the bishop then goes back to the square it needs to go to, at the same time, it stops the knight using the f3 square. So the bishop goes back, and then h4 is played with the obvious idea of just playing h5 and trapping the bishop on g6. So g5 was played, and knight h3 is recommended here, to be honest, because after h takes g4, what you do is you play knight f4 here. And the idea is you want to snap the bishop on g6 and weaken the king side. For example, if we go g takes here, knight takes g6, f takes g6, and then the queen takes. And the idea is that these pawns are all a bit raggedy, and after a move like e6, queen g4 neatly attacks both pawns there. Black, therefore, probably should retreat, but then f takes g4 here. And white's okay. White's got a lot of space in this position, as you can see. Okay, so c5 was played instead, which was a good reply, because there's not a lot happening on the king side now, so black can afford to strike back into the center straight away. So bishop out, and we swap. Queen takes, knight here. Now, interestingly enough, there is quite commonly in the Caro-Kann advanced variation this disruptive move of e6. And the idea, of course, is you want to encourage black to weaken the king side, possibly by taking the pawn and allowing the queen to g6 check. After c takes d4, e takes f7 looks tempting, but funnily enough, after king takes, having said that the idea is to open up the king side, after queen check here, black king's actually reasonably safe, because if you keep trying to check, the king is just going to run to the queen side anyway. So, and black is up a pawn in this position. So d takes c5, knight takes e5. Again, a little bit iffy. e6 was probably better here. You've still got both these pawns under attack, and if white tries to hang on to everything with queen b5, queen d7 and bishop f4, knight ge7, and sure, white is still up a pawn, but black is rapidly getting themselves organized, developing some pieces. And eventually one of these pawns will fall, I suspect. Knight g6 is an idea here, hitting the bishop and hitting the pawn on e5. So, knight takes e5, queen b5 check, queen d7. And again, knight c3 was probably a better try here. One of the mistakes that I certainly made when I was very much younger as a chess player was I kept exchanging things. I would exchange all the time and I would swap, and I'd be the one doing the swapping. And eventually I'd lose a long game rather than a short game. Sometimes it's better to make your opponent swap. Okay, if your opponent wants to swap queens, that's fine, but you recapture with a piece that you've developed, and then the knight on b5 is a lot stronger. So knight c3, something like e6, bishop to f4, knight back to g6, knight g2, rook c8. Notice that there hasn't been an exchange of queens because I think in this case both sides figure that taking and letting the other player recapture gives them a small advantage. Instead, white just took straight away, and knight takes was played. Probably king takes does work here. Normally you don't bring your king out too early, but there are exceptions to this rule. One, if queens are off, it's a bit safer to bring your king out early, and if there aren't too many open lines heading towards your king, it's often a lot safer to bring your king out. Notice if you take on d7, there's no white squared bishop for white to try and start checking the king. So knight takes d7 though, knight to c3 hitting the pawn, e6 defends, b4 then protects the c pawn. a5 is not a bad idea, rook c8 is also a good idea with the idea of playing b6 to attack the c pawn, taking advantage of, for now at least, that the rook has an x-ray attack on the knight. If the pawn moved out of the way, then the rook is going to take the knight. So knight b5. Here is not a bad idea. We're just threatening, obviously. Knight c7, winning the rook in the corner with the knight fork, as we attack both king and rook. But often these moves aren't played in the hope that your opponent will miss it. These moves are played because you force your opponent to deal with that threat, and then you get to do what you really wanted to do. So black castled, which turned out not to be the best way of dealing with this situation. King d8 was fine. Knight d6 was obviously white's plan, following up from knight b5. a3 had been suggested, keeping the move to d6 in reserve, and at the same time keeping a nice, well-organised pawn chain on the queen side. Knight d6 though, bishop takes d6, we take with the pawn, and black takes on b4, and in fact black is a pawn up in this position. No, sorry, white, let me count. Yes, black is a pawn up in this position. And the main problem that white has with that sequence of moves is the pawn on d6 isn't particularly strong. So bishop to d2, trying to win back the pawn. We go knight e5, and black is going to round up the d pawn pretty much straight away. B takes holds that off for just a few moves, and then the knight goes to c4. Now I want to draw attention to something quite interesting in this game, and that is if you have a look at what I've circled in red, both white and black's kingside rook and knight haven't been developed yet. And I see this a lot in games of players below about 1600, even though both of these players are probably a little bit above that or at that level. But there is a tendency to look at the short-term moves, as in, oh, can I attack this? Can I threaten this? Can I play this check? Rather than that, can I leave that till later while I get myself organised? So white at least starts bringing the knights out, and the knight goes back and wins the pawn. Okay, so black is still now a good pawn up here. So we centralise the knights. At some point, the rooks have to join into the game for both sides. And rook b1, I think white is now starting to try and target, say, b7 as a weakness. Knight ef5 there, offering the swap. And white decides not to exchange. And probably the main reason for not exchanging is if you're down a pawn, you're not going to be exchanging too many things. But also, this knight is heading to c5. Knight goes to c4, knight goes to c5. And then knight d4 is not a bad move. We're forking again. Pawn on f3, pawn on c2. As I read just recently, most combinations and tactics are based on the concept of the double attack. As in you attack two things at once, and the golden rule of chess, or one of the many golden rules of chess, is you're only allowed to play one move in a row. So if you threaten to do two things, almost always your opponent can only do and stop one thing. And then you take advantage of that by doing the other thing. So bishop to c3 stops, and black decided to capture the c2 pawn. Taking the f3 pawn looks kind of okay, but is a little bit more risky. King e2, for example. d4 is a good move here because you don't want to allow bishop takes g7. But after rook takes b7, d takes c3, king takes f3. Rook d5 looks like it's a really good move because you're threatening to take the rook. Threatening to take the knight. And if the knight moves out of the way, the rook on b7 is unprotected. But rook a7 is a sneaky reply because after rook takes e5, you've just got to be careful about rook a8 check, forcing the king to move, and then you pick up the rook on h8, which on one level is karma for the fact that that rook never got developed in the first place. But that didn't happen. Knight took on c2 instead. King moved to d1 and then back for a check. King e2 and then d4, just as in the other line, is the right idea here. It cuts the bishop off from g7. So the bishop went back to d2 and black played b3 here, which wasn't quite the best move in this position. d3 was, but it did involve some calculation. So d3 check, you're forcing the king to move because if the knight takes, you actually can get away with rook takes here. And at first you think, oh, well, this is a bit silly. You're giving away the exchange, but after king takes, you play the other rook across. And then when the king moves out of the way, you can pick up the bishop, either with knight takes or rook takes or whatever. And it's two pieces and a pawn for a rook, which if you remember from your school days is 7 points versus 5 points, and black is easily winning. So b6 was played, punting the knight. So the knight went back to d3 and blocks d4 now. King to b7. And around about here, black has a clear advantage. Black is up 2 pawns. Knights are nicely placed in the center. The rooks are active. So how did the game end up in a draw? Around about here, it starts to go wrong for black. Just a few choices. And one of the other lessons from this game is that when we first start playing chess, games are often decided by big mistakes. As we get better at chess and we play stronger players, the big mistakes dry up, but a lot of little mistakes still hang around. And that's kind of probably what happened here. So bishop takes e3 and d takes e3, I think, is definitely the first of the mistakes that black makes in this position. Knight takes e3 was a lot better because it also keeps the pawn structure a little bit better with the no double pawns. Rook hc1, for example, knight d5. And yeah, black just needs to sort out her rooks and everything's fine. But d takes, and the problem is that knight is tied to defending that pawn, and if that knight is forced to move, the pawn on e3 goes, and this is kind of what happens here. Rook b4, simple idea. Rook d4 defends it, because example, if we just play knight d6, of course, we're just taking the pawn. So rook d4 defends, but then knight check, not a bad move. Because of the pin, the knight can't be captured. King goes to c6, again, is a little bit iffy, because it puts the king on an open file for the rook on h1 to come across to c1. So the knight goes to b3, so the rook's under attack. And we head to f4 because we've got to keep the rook on the same rank as the knight, otherwise rook takes knight is going to happen. And then rook c1, and we can now see some of the issues here. That knight is pinned everywhere. It's pinned against the king by the rook on c1, and it's pinned against the rook by the rook on b4. So b5 is about the only decent response here. And now white has got well back into the game. So despite being 2 pawns down, white has lots of threats, and a4 is one of them. We could have tried a4, for example, rook a8, a takes b5, king d5, and we actually won back one of the pawns, and it's quite a strong passed pawn, and white would be looking in some lines just to run it up to the end of the board, and that ties up black's pieces. The other issue here is white has finally completed a bit of development. Black still has this issue of the rook, which hasn't been doing anything. So knight a5 check, king across to d6, and then rook takes b5. So picked up one of the pawns, and the black king is now a lot less safe than the white king, surprisingly. It was different early on in the game, but now the black king's gone wandering. It's under attack from the white pieces. Knight takes a5, rook takes a5, rook takes h4, and I think black might have been counting on the fact that as long as they stay 2 pawns ahead, they're eventually going to win the ending. Turns out not to be the case. King takes e3, so it's only a pawn now. Okay. Having said that, the H pawn could be quite strong. And finally, the rook on H8 joins in the game on move 38, which is quite a long time to leave it sitting there. Now, white should draw this game, but kind of chose the wrong way to do it before eventually hitting on the right strategy. Rook A6 was probably the best move, and there are two reasons why this is. One, it's probably drawing with best play, but two, you also give your opponent a chance to make some mistakes. For example, King E5, walk straight into mate in one. So you don't want that to happen, okay? But if you have a choice between moves which are clearly drawn, and your opponent can make a mistake, maybe you want to roll the dice with the mistake move. King D5 is a little bit safer, but then after Rook D1, you're still inviting mistakes like King E5, because Rook A5 leads to mate as well, which is quite embarrassing. And King C5 though, and Rook D7, and suddenly White's rooks are super active and are looking to try and clean up the pawns on the 7th rank, which is what rooks do. So Rook A C5 instead, and then Rook B6 is the right move at least, or Rook B7 was also fine. And the idea is you just want to keep the rooks away from the 7th rank. In this case, Rook C7 could have been played, F5, take on G6, Rook A4, and then you've got some competing issues here. The black rooks are going to try and clean up on the queen side, take the A pawn and work something out, but white has a very strong pawn on G5, which could become a queen if black isn't careful. So rook went back to C3 because now white is looking for a simple drawing idea here, which kind of gets executed after Rook A4. So Rook D3 check, King E7, Rook C7 check here, and as long as black doesn't commit suicide with King F8, which is Rook D8 mate, the game's a draw. So King E8, Rook check, King has to come up, Rook check, King has to go back, Rook check, and that's pretty much how the game ended at that point there. So it was a hard-fought game. Black really did, though, have an advantage around about this point after D4. 2 pawns ahead, strong position, but just kind of little mistakes here and there just let the whole thing fritter away, unfortunately. And white did well to get both rooks into the game, and then taking advantage of lack of king safety for black, was able to find the draw at the end of the game. So that was the last game the last round of that tournament. As I said, won by Sully Avancible with a very impressive 5.5 out of 6. If you want to play some online chess in the ACT Chess Association events, it's Wednesday night now for Rapid from 7 p.m. Canberra time. So this means also I'll be cutting back the number of streams and videos I put up to 1 a week now, unless there's something special happening. I do these live at 10 a.m. The day after the event on Twitch, and then I will upload them across to YouTube. And if you want to see them on YouTube, you can just look for Sean Press on YouTube as well. So it'll be another week before I see you, or almost a week before I see you. So thanks for tuning in, and I will see you then.